Krystal. Thank you so much for joining us today. Specifically, my name is Krystal Vuong Wegner, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a contractor with Inclusive Communities, and I'd like to welcome you all today to this virtual table talk. And I'm honored to serve as a moderator today and with this panel of amazing women. So the Table Talks for Inclusive Communities was started so that we as community members could gather together and hold space for each other and have meaningful dialogue around difficult topics. So this month of May also happens to be Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and the recent events this year have brought us here today. And while our focus today and in June's upcoming table talk is going to be building community, particularly in response to the spike of violence and harassment the Asian communities have faced over the course of this past year, we are also looking forward to holding future conversations to elevate and highlight AAPI voices, perspectives, and stories. So to help us kick off this series, please welcome me in joining for today's conversation with Lorraine Chang, Dr. Sharon Ishii-Jordan, and Maria Corpuz. So I'm going to just read a brief bio on everyone, and just so that the audience can get familiar with these amazing women, and we will just dive into our conversation. So Lorraine Chang was born in New York City to parents who emigrated from China to pursue their educations. She's had an auspicious career in law and marketing, and in 2008, Lorraine was elected to the Learning Community Coordinating Council. She served as council chair from 2012 to 2018, and now serves as board president of the Learning Community Foundation. She also serves on a number of other boards dedicated to improving the lives of women and children. Lorraine is also the independent chair of the board of trustees of the Whites Funds. We also have here Maria Corpuz. Maria is a Filipino-American woman from Omaha. She graduated from Creighton University School of Journalism, Media, and Computing in 2016. And since then, she's been exploring multiple ways to utilize the power of collaborative conversation to improve her community. And in 2018, she founded Nightcaps, a late night show that impacts the community culture by hosting conversations for those that hold diverse influences and perspectives within the Omaha community. And finally, we have Dr. Sharon Ishii-Jordan with us today. She is a retired associate dean from the College of Arts and Sciences at Creighton University and is a professor emerita of education. She serves on the board of the Japanese American Citizens League, JACL, the Omaha chapter, and has given numerous presentations and teacher workshops on Japanese American history and Asian American discrimination. So thank you again for being with us here today. And Sharon, if you wouldn't mind starting us off by kind of giving us a brief overview of the history of anti-Asian discrimination and why what we are facing today, while shocking, is not new.
Yes, I'm happy to. So just a quick bit about the reason I'm giving this background is because there are a lot of misperceptions about Asian Americans, Asian Pacific Islanders, things like you all look the same, that you must be very intelligent, dangerous or sneaky, and the one that I think most of us feel, and that is that we are perpetual foreigners. No matter how long our families have been here. In my case, it's 5 to 6 generations, 114 years my family's been here. So where do the perceptions originate? In the history of discrimination against persons of Asians in the United States, there has been a lot of it in terms of immigration and legislation. So some of the highlights are just 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, and it prevented immigration of Chinese laborers. It was the first and only law so far that has excluded all members of a specific ethnic or national group from immigrating to the United States. And because they were stopping Japanese laborers increased. In 1907, then, the Gentlemen's Agreement Act was signed between Japan and the U.S., and it restricted Japanese unskilled workers from immigrating to the U.S. And with that, there were anti-miscegenation laws that you may have heard about from other racism discussions. And then we moved from there into the 1913 alien land laws. These were a popular form of discrimination. California and then subsequently 14 other Western states passed laws that banned what was called aliens ineligible for citizenship from owning or leasing land. And this was on the books until 1956. In 1922, to understand that term, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Japanese and Asian Indians were not eligible for citizenship. Again, no matter how long they lived in the United States. It's a very important term in racism because it's used over and over without having to say Japanese or Indian. The Cable Act was passed in 1922. This discriminated against American women, not Asians necessarily, unless they were Nisei, second-born Asian women who are Americans because they were born here. The Cable Act said that American women lost their citizenship if they married an alien ineligible for citizenship. Again, not having to say an ethnic group. And then 1924, the National Origins Act excluded aliens ineligible for citizenship from immigrating to the U.S., and they set quotas for other Asians. Therefore, Filipinos began being brought into the United States as laborers, and that was the time period that the U.S. annexed the Philippines. You know about World War II, you know about the Pearl Harbor bombing, and it was the year after that, in February of 1942, that President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Executive Order 9066, which enabled the U.S. military to begin forcibly removing persons of Japanese descent and putting them into camps. They were called internment camps at the time. We now call them incarceration camps because they were surrounded by barbed wire with guards and guns. My mother and her siblings were all caught up in that. She was born and raised in Sacramento with her 9 siblings, and their families were put into 2 different camps during that time period. And then, of course, we started seeing 1975 period, more Southeast Asians coming to the U.S., a lot of discrimination against them as they came, because there were over 1 million between 1975 and 1994. And whenever you have a number coming, then you start seeing more discrimination occurring, especially when it comes to economics. And a lot along the Gulf Coast who were settled there were discriminated against by the fishers and the shrimpers who were there before they arrived. And so that's kind of, in a nutshell, there's a lot more in terms of discrimination, but those are the highlights that I wanted to bring up that helps explain this idea of misperception of Asian Americans.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And Sharon has a great presentation that includes a PowerPoint that we will probably have cover in the June table talk. But thank you, Sharon. That was really helpful. And especially, it's a lot of the information, unfortunately, is new for me as well, because it's not taught in schools, right, in our curriculum. So, and I think stresses, again, the importance of including Asian stories in our history. So I kind of wanted to just ask you all, I wanted to check in with you. I think after the Atlanta shootings in March, what was meaningful for me was having my friends and family check in with me. You know, something that you think is so minor is actually quite significant and impactful when you're going through trauma. And I wanted to check in with all 3 of you and ask how this year has been for you.
I will comment because the Atlanta spot killings really had a very emotional impact for me. And it caused me to recruit Krystal, and with help from the Women's Fund, on whose board we both serve, we crafted an op-ed piece for the World Herald that got published. And it was cathartic in a sense of having our voices be heard, because I think Krystal and I shared our stories with each other, and we learned that our upbringing, being mostly focused on assimilation, had a dark side of also causing Asian Americans in general to be invisible and wanting to keep our voices low and down. So it felt good, I think, to really have our voices be heard and help people understand that the Atlanta Spa killings were a hate crime. And in fact, that's been validated because the district attorney in Fulton County there in Atlanta has declared that they will pursue a hate crime indictment for the perpetrator. And so that really sort of shook us to the core and began a journey, I think, of revitalizing, for me anyway, a feeling of solidarity in bringing Asian Americans in Omaha together, like the four of us, and others who are interested in having our perspectives have a more powerful voice.
Thanks, Lorraine and Sharon, for giving us awesome information. I think that I'm kind of with Krystal in the sense, and I think a lot of other folks who I've talked to kind of agree with that on top of going through all this grief of this past year, we're also going through the beginning of learning about our own cultures and our own experiences and the experiences of other Asian American and Pacific Islanders. So I've had to really just try and be patient with myself by trying to like learn and grieve at the same time, because it's kind of just been like going together. And at the beginning of this pandemic, I started out living with my grandmother. And so I would just go in there and I really started to kind of track her stories. And I knew most of them, but really trying to get the details and asking more questions about her experience. And she brought my father over here when he was 2. And so he doesn't speak Tagalog, and actually doesn't really, he'll say he understands some things, but not really. But because they wanted so much to Americanize and to assimilate, like Lorraine was saying. And I think that on top of us being invisible, our ancestors' history is invisible to ourselves. So in a sense, we become invisible to ourselves. And so it's reclaiming that visibility for me right now.
Well, thank you, Lorraine, Maria, and Krystal. I'll tell you just a little bit about myself, more than what you heard. I was born in Japan, actually, but I'm a third-generation Japanese American. My grandparents came over as immigrants, 3 of them. One grandparent was Bohemian American, so I'm 3/4 Japanese and 1/4 Bohemian. I'm mixed there. I don't look as Asian as some of my cousins, whose parents are both of Japanese descent. But I was born there because my father was in the U.S. Air Force and was stationed there, and my mother went there to join him. So I ended up being born there. But I was born and raised in the Japanese American Citizens League, the JACL organization. My mother was one of the founding officers of that organization. And in 1946, I believe, the chapter in Omaha started. 1929 is when the whole organization was in place on the West Coast. And after the camps, when my mother's family came here, they joined my father's family. My father was born and raised in Omaha. The new and the old Japanese Americans came together there with different experiences. My father's family never experienced the camps. My mother's family did. But part of that being born and raised in the organization, that from the early time of my youth, I was exposed to uncles and aunts and other members, Japanese American members, doing a lot of civil rights activities, because the JACL is a civil rights organization as well as a cultural preservation and educational organization. So my aunt and uncle helped to push for the passage of the Walter McCarran Act, which then allowed Japanese to become citizens. They were no longer aliens ineligible for citizenship. So that was 1952. And when my grandparents finally were able to become citizens, even though they arrived from around 1907 onward. I also was there with a lot of workshops for the youth in our organization to learn about our Japanese American history, and later on more Asian American history. And then my uncle and aunt and I were part of that push to get the reparations from the Civil Liberties Act that was passed in 1988, so that those who were incarcerated in the camps were able to get an apology letter from the government, some reparations in cash, and a large education fund was begun, where a lot of different groups could apply for it, get grants, and then begin teaching about this time period in history. So that's been a part of who I've been growing up and learning about that. It's only more recently in the last 10 years that I've gotten more of Pan-Asian American history and learning that, because that did impact the Japanese American history.
Wow, Sharon, that's amazing. I mean, so I feel like you've been activated and engaged very early on, which, you know, it's interesting because it sounds like, you know, the rest of us are kind of finding our identities right now after having just grown with wanting to be a part of, you know, assimilation. And I find myself in this moment being, I've been out of touch with my cultural identity for as long as I can remember. Out here in Omaha, I haven't really found a community. So when we gathered together as a group, that has helped me process through all this. And I feel like these past few months have been a lot of learning and unlearning, as I imagine a lot of us are going through right now. So I'm thankful for all of your perspectives, and it helps to know that we are not alone in any of this. And, you know, I just wanted to ask you, how have you experienced, you know, anti-Asian discrimination in your lives? And how have you processed that?
Well, I can start because I've experienced anti-Asian bias in the full range, I would say, throughout my life. So starting at one end with microaggressions, and Sharon in her talk really emphasizes this, but the microaggressions of, you know, people asking, where are you from? Oh, you speak such good English. All well intended, but still accentuating the fact that we're foreigners, right? To stereotypes. And so when I applied to Berkeley Law School, I was admitted, but at the time, I received a letter telling me that they had enrolled me in remedial English. And I decided not to go there because I did not want to be put into that group, you know, labeled as a group that didn't understand English. I was perfectly fluent and really resented being stereotyped in that way.
Wow.
And then the third thing was discrimination. And the story is that when I came to Omaha in 1980 looking for a legal position, I interviewed with a large law firm in town. And I remember sitting around the conference table, and one person in the group interviewing me, one of the other attorneys, said to me, well, you know, you're at a disadvantage in 3 ways. You're short, Asian, and a woman. So that was enlightening because I had just moved here. And then most recently, as a consequence of the xenophobia and tie that our administration in the past had linked Asian Americans and specifically Chinese Americans to the COVID-19 virus, I actually received a xenophobic note under my door accusing me of or linking me with deaths related to COVID-19, which was what I would call scapegoating, another form of discrimination. So, you know, it comes in multiple forms, and it's been interesting for me as a journey to reflect on the various ways that it can affect an individual, and I know I'm not alone. These are incidents that happen to Asian Americans. And I would also say the impetus for the op-ed piece that Krystal and I wrote related to the stereotyping of Asian women, especially in terms of the sexualization and objectification of women of Asian descent. So all of that is a little overwhelming when you put it all together, but I think it also motivates us to really do more in terms of setting the record straight.
Yeah, Lorraine, I was going to say that I think mine has really been like the fetishization and the sexualization and the persistency of asking where I'm from as an exotic person. And it's really interesting because I feel like the racism that I experience is half because I'm Asian and half of people mistaking me for being Mexican or from Latin America or from Guatemala or Native American. And because I look very ambiguous, it's like I get the whole spectrum of racism on that. And I think that as I kind of sat on this question, I was like, wow, even in my family, so my mother is white and she came from probably like an upper middle class suburban family out of Kansas City. And when when her and my dad started to really get serious, like I feel like the racism against me started before I was even born because her parents were very concerned that her kids were going to be brown if they continued their relationship. And I didn't learn that until a few years ago. And unfortunately, my grandmother, like she loves us and she came around to us. But her concern and implicit biases and I think really had an effect on then my dad and my Lola, who's my dad's mom. Because then I discovered it a little bit more this past summer because I asked her, like, Lola, when have you experienced racism? And that was one of the stories that she told me. And it just kind of broke my heart. And so to learn, I think I'm learning how to heal both sides of my family.
I think one of the paradoxes
For me,
I think she's
go ahead, Lorraine.
Yeah, I was just going to say the paradox is that while we experience this kind of bias and want to be our own individual self, there's also this solidarity that we're feeling, with those who we share Asian descent. And I know in my own growing up, on the weekday, I was very American, all American, cheerleader, going to school in a white suburban neighborhood. Whereas on the weekends, I was all Chinese, eating all Chinese food every night and on weekends with all my parents' Chinese American families. My mother worked at the United Nations, so many of her friends from China had come over for education reasons and ended up working at the United Nations. And that kind of dual childhood. But it also made me appreciate my heritage. So I have always been brought up appreciating my Chinese culture. I think my father really instilled that in me particularly. And so it's not so much a recent awakening of that as much as it has been more the advocacy and the realization that we need to fight bias.
Yeah.
For me, going to school in Omaha, I was one of 3 Asian Americans in the school. So it's basically white, West Omaha school. And so it's like Lorraine, you live a bicultural experience. And there's code switching, not just language, but of culture. So Asians are expected to be, in my culture, Japanese Americans, and I know other Asian cultures, more deferential to to your elders, and you don't speak up very much. That was one thing we heard a Japanese saying by older aunt. Children were not to talk. However, when we were in school, we were expected to speak up. Okay? So it's a living the majority culture when you're at school, and then going back into your own culture when you're at home. And that you learn to switch back and forth and when to read the signs of what to do. And so sometimes there's more comfort in being around somebody else who has some of the same language, and you can just fall into the English. And for me, English and Japanese, you throw some Japanese words in there when there's nothing matching it in English. And everyone understands, you don't have to explain. But then you have to come out of that and come into the majority world when you're not with your culture. I experienced something that was really surprising when I was a senior in high school, and it came time to vote. So I was 18, we were able to register, and people came to school to register everyone. It was my turn. I walked up in the line, and they said, "Where were you born?" And I said, "Fukuoka, Japan." And they said, "Well, are you a citizen?" And I said, "Well, yes, I'm a citizen. Both my parents were born in the United States." They said, "But you weren't." And I said, "No, but I'm a citizen." And they said, "Well, we don't know what to do with that." And they were conferring with each other, trying to figure out whether or not I could register to vote.
Wow.
And so that was something they were not taught about, what to do. And I said, I was born on an American base. Parents are American, but still, they had to try and figure out what to do. Eventually, I was able to vote. And then there was one other time in terms of this perpetual foreigner. When I was on a plane, I was, I think, college age, going to California to visit my cousins there, and had a nice conversation with a man on the plane all the way over. And it wasn't until we got closer to San Francisco that he said to me, "So what are you coming here for?" And I said, I'm going to be visiting relatives and then attending something dealing with my Japanese American organization. He said, "Oh, you're Japanese?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, you speak English really good." And I said, "No, I speak English really well." So there's something that you want to say, but you have to figure out how to say it, and how do you put those the ignorance, and how do you educate? So it's always, for me, looking for a way to teach, an opportunity to teach about something.
Yeah, it's that weird being in dual identities, right? It's feeling like we were all born here in America, and so I see myself first and foremost as an American. But now I'm kind of re-examining that, because in recent years, when I was younger, I just wanted to fit in. I lived in a very diverse community, but we didn't talk about we didn't talk about color. We didn't see color. We didn't talk about our races or our ethnicities. And it was just kind of, we just wanted to all just be together and belong. And, now as I'm in my late 30s, I'm finally realizing how much my identity is a part of me, and part of my culture. And I'm raising biracial children, and I want them to very much identify with the Vietnamese part of them, because especially here in Omaha, you just don't see a lot of us. And it's important for me that we, when we come home to see my family in California, that we eat Vietnamese food and they hear the language. I don't want that to be lost, because, like your father, Maria, I grew up speaking and understanding Vietnamese, but I lost it as soon as I started school. And it's like, to my everlasting regret, that I was never able to communicate with my paternal grandmother, because she only spoke Vietnamese and I only spoke English. So it's a lot of coming to terms with that, but then also feeling like an other as well, right? I mean, there's not a lot of representation. And when you hear well-meaning strangers on the street ask you where you're from, or no, where are you really from? It's like constantly dealing with that you realize it kind of eats away at you. And I think that I never really quite dwelled upon the fact that these are microaggressions that we were facing on a daily basis, because it didn't seem all that harmful. But you know what they say about microaggressions? It's like when someone hits you on the arm repeatedly over and over again, it's hurtful. And so, you know, it's again, I wanted to ask you what caused you to want to speak up now in this moment, and finally, and be here with us today. Because I feel like a lot of us are activated now. And is it because of this recent surge, or are we, you know, realizing that the microaggressions that we faced growing up actually were harmful to us in ways that we probably didn't really understand or process?
In my view, it's the time is now because there's a window of opportunity. You know, so much of media attention is focused now on it, on anti-Asian hate. And so we need to take advantage of the timing and also ensure that the education awareness building that goes on now endures, so that over time our voices aren't lost. So I think that it's a critical time, and the time is now.
Mm-hmm. I think my activism probably started in 2016. Before that, I wasn't as concerned about it until I was able to go down to Nogales, Mexico, and filmed a documentary down there on migration. And seeing I, you know, just spoke with folks who had just been deported that day and their experience, and seeing all that, I decided that I wanted to kind of figure out what needed to be done in Omaha. But Asian American and Pacific Islander hate was not the reason why I got into it. And so I think now with, especially with COVID and the rhetoric of our last president, and, you know, when they come for one person, they're going to come for the next person kind of mindset, I can see that. It was really important for me to start talking about it a lot more. And especially in my family, because like you said, Krystal, we didn't really talk about race growing up. And after the Atlantic shooting, we have a lot of family dinners and we have really rich conversations where we sit there for hours, but never about race and our experiences. And even a microaggression my brother just recently got was, wow, you look like a samurai. And he texted me and was like, hey, can you tell me why that's racist? And I was like, well, how does that make you feel? And because I didn't really know how to answer, we just know it's wrong and we know it's racist. And I think that's the other thing that I am specifically learning how to do, is to stick up to those microaggressions, because I've let them slide to the side for so long. And so it's like, well, how do I respectfully bring up that, hey, that's actually not a nice thing to say to me or to somebody that I am with. And I think it's kind of, my Lola and I have a different mindset on this, right? So she tells me to just get a thicker skin. And that it kind of broke my heart this past year, because she said, you know, white folks are always going to have this racist kind of thing in them because it's been within them for so long. So she'll say things like that, but then she'll also say that, oh, well, don't worry about it. If you let it worry about it, you're going to be really anxious. And then I just think it's so interesting, bringing in kind of like mental health into Asian American families. At least in mine, they call it stress anxiety. Oh, well, I'm just really stressed. But then my grandfather passed away from a heart attack, and my dad is 55 and has had a few. And so I'm like, yes, stress, but also anxiety, and that's okay. And so how do we talk through that? And our, you know, epigenetics, our ancestral trauma that we also hold, I think is really important. I think I'm like kind of skewering off here, but I'll pause. I could dive into all of that.
No, I relate a lot to that. when all this was happening, and this was starting, in the past few months, these attacks happening on elders, I checked in on my parents who would live out in California, in Southern California, Orange County, again, one of the bigger Vietnamese populations. So we never really quite worried about their safety, but they take walks on the beach every day. And I asked them, like, how are you feeling? Are you feeling at all concerned about your safety? And my mom, who very much, she's a Vietnamese refugee, both my parents are, and I think they're a little cynical about politics and about, government and how, what can we really do? We just need to just live our lives and just try to be happy. And she just said, as long as I feel fine, as long as we keep our heads down and we just don't call attention to ourselves, we'll be fine. And that broke my heart, because the elders who are being attacked have done the same thing. And yet, they never did anything to call out attention to themselves. And yet they're being singled out and attacked. And so, that leads to the harm that our invisibility has given to us, right? Like we've been model citizens. We have just kept our heads down and worked hard, and we were taught that was what was going to get us a better life. And maybe to some degree that has worked for some, but I think it's also harmed us, right? Because now, as we are trying to, in this moment, call out attention and call out these racist incidents, we're finding our voices, and we're finding that it takes some practice to learn the tools and find the language to defend ourselves and call it out.
Yeah, that's true. I think when we look at what happens to other people, it's the first generation who typically, I think of various Asian cultures, who will say to keep your head down, to that's just something you do, you bear through it. In my culture, Japanese, we always heard shikataganai, which means it can't be helped. It can't be helped.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Don't rock the boat. Don't be the nail that comes above the board, because that's the one that gets smashed. So just ignore it. And I think that may have been a detriment to us as Asian descendants of people from Asia, because we've learned not to speak up. And for the Japanese Americans, it wasn't until the second generation after the war, the second generation are the ones who began pushing for the Civil Liberties Act and an apology. And it's usually the third generation that comes back around, and they come to find their roots again. So the first generation completely with their culture. The second generation, it's a conflict, wanting to get rid of everything that makes me look different, and join with the majority. And the third generation are often much more embracing of and inquisitive about the culture. Grandma, what was this like? Grandma, how do you say this? So there's kind of a cycle in the psychology of it, and what happens with us as we're finding our identity. In terms of being part of this larger group, or this Pan-Asian group, I think that's a newer thing as well. What's been nicer kind of this time around, when attacks have occurred with Asian Americans, is that nationally there have been voices that speak up, and it's not just Asian voices. When we make a comparison, and I've done this in talks, between what happened with Japanese Americans and the camps, World War II, there was only one group that spoke out across the country and said this was wrong, and that was the Friends Society, or the Quakers. And in their pulpits and every place, they said this is not right, this is wrong. Others didn't speak up. They didn't want to, because that was the enemy we were fighting, and what if I support these people, then I'm for the enemy. And so that was much harder. When 9/11, when attacks occurred against the Muslim Americans, and there was talk of rounding them up and putting them into camps, the Japanese Americans came out right away and said, no, you cannot do this. And because there were Asian Americans in Congress who had been through that period, they were able to use their voices to say no. And so there was a lot more spoken to support people who were being intimidated and discriminated against because of something that happened outside of this country, and they were tagged in identification. There was much more. And I think this time around, with the anti-Asian sentiment, you will hear that national voice, that national conversation occurring, which didn't happen way back. So while we're seeing that happen, we're seeing more activation of pan-Asian groups coming forth. There also is that national awareness, much more than it had been in the past.
Baby steps, right?
Yes.
I'm really glad that you said that, Sharon, because I've been about the third generation thing, because part of me is like, well, I obviously respect Lola and everything, her experiences and what she's been through. But at times it's like frustrating because I feel like I'm just like, can you see it this way, the way that I'm seeing it? And she's proud. She'll say she's proud of being Filipino, but sometimes like that doesn't translate into actions and thoughts on social justice issues. And so I'm like the sensitive one, and I'm like the kind of button pusher when it comes to this stuff. But I always just like, when I do get frustrated, and hopefully this helps people who are listening, having these conversations, but reminding yourself that their experiences are valid. But that trauma and that way of thinking about those experiences gets to end with me. And that like kind of gives myself hope for my future ancestors and the generations to come. But that was something that I really had a hard time with, of the way I see the world, and then relating to the way she sees the world, and knowing that we're so interconnected, but having that still be okay.
Yeah, and there's that sense of not being, we can't make judgments about some of the things that that first generation is saying or doing, because we weren't in their shoes. We didn't go through what they went through. And times have changed, becoming more hopeful. And so we can say, yes, I understand that how you're feeling that way, but my time is different here. So my voice can speak out where maybe yours couldn't, or your culture was strong enough that it prevented your voice from speaking out.
Yeah, thank you.
I also want to call out that we have been receiving several comments from viewers who, I mean, it seems like a lot of people are relating to what is being said here. So thank you for sharing, and thank you for commenting, everyone. So I guess the next question that I would want to bring up is, so what can we as a community do to take a stand in solidarity and allyship? Like what have, circling back to Lorraine, what happened with that letter that was sent to you? I'm so sorry that happened to you. And I think it's important to tell how you were able to report the incident and the response that you received in the community when you did that, because not a lot of people feel comfortable in reporting, and it's important. It's important to do that. You know, I think Stop AAPI has been collecting all these anti-Asian incidents over this past year. And I wrote down that since March 2020 to March 2021, there has been 6,603 reports of anti-Asian incidents. 65% of all reports are reported by women, which is, I found interesting. And a big percentage is towards youth and elders as well, which is awful. So.
Well, I think that it's, there are 2 points I want to make about that. One is solidarity. So allyship is the term that the Anti-Defamation League speaks to surround yourself with allies who support you and comfort you. And in my case, that was really important for me to get through what I experienced. And it also gave me confidence to report to a number of different channels. So the ADL is keeping track in Omaha of all anti-hate incidents, or all hate incidents and crime. for whatever reason. So they're known for tracking anti-Semitism, but they're also in allyship with other minorities who are experiencing hateful incidents. The police, the Omaha Police Department does accept reports on hate incidents, even if they're not hate crimes. And I learned that a hate crime has to rise, in order to rise to the level of a hate crime, it needs to be specifically targeted at an individual, and there has to be some evidence of a threat. And in my case, it wasn't addressed specifically to me, even though it was put under my door. And even though I felt threatened, the wording of the note wasn't explicitly threatening. So I was, thinking that I really couldn't report it. But in fact, the police accept these reports as a first step. In the event there's a need to investigate a situation further, they have a record of what might have transpired early on in a process. So fortunately, I have not received anything more threatening or personal, but the police took it very seriously. I was very gratified and felt very respected, and the officers were all very compassionate who listened to my story. They took my note into evidence and are keeping it for fingerprinting. So just know that our Omaha Police Department will take these situations very seriously, and it's important to report. And then nationally, I also reported it to those organizations like Stop AAPI Hate and other organizations that are keeping track nationally, because I think it's important for people to know that these kinds of situations are happening in mid-America, in Omaha, Nebraska. It's not just relegated to the coasts or where there are large Asian populations. The rhetoric has inflamed this kind of hate all across the country and all kinds of places. And so it's helpful and important to know. I'm also going to be talking to the residents in my building to get a no hate resolution passed, so that, you'd think you could take that for granted, that you want to have a safe and welcoming, secure environment to live in. But obviously, it's an important thing to emphasize and to declare as a value. And so I'm making sure that that is explicitly acknowledged also.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that.
I would also
Maria?
say just one other quick thing in terms of solidarity. One experience that I had back in the 1990s, I was one of the Asian American appointees to the Clinton administration, of which there were many of us, thankfully. And the administration brought together all of the Asian American appointees in one place for a gathering related to Asian American Heritage Month that year in 1994. It was really exciting and really important to me to have that experience, and it awakened in me a strong sense of solidarity with other Asian Americans who are just like me. Having grown up in a largely white suburban neighborhood and college and law school experience, so forth, this was really an eye-opening experience. And we gathered together and formed an organization that still exists called the Asian American Government Executive Network, which is designed to promote leadership, AAPI leadership in the federal government. And it just, to me, is an example of how when people come together, we're so much more of a force, and to bring about change and to promote others to be more visible and be more active in leadership roles in our community.
Yeah, absolutely, Lorraine. I think that, I mean, when you look at even just our own state legislature, we don't have any representation. We almost did on city council. I know Kate ran, which would have been really amazing, especially during this time. So I second that. I think we need to find, yes, thank you. Think we need to be nurturing more leadership skills within our communities and figuring out how we can hold power for our own communities and space to listen. And I wanted to just kind of comment on allyship. I don't think it's a title that we get to keep. I think it's a practice that we continue to work at. And when you have, I think when I kind of shifted that thought in my head to a practice, that it's okay to not get it perfect, because a lot of us are new as Asian Americans. And so if you're not, we at least have our experiences, but if you are not, it's still a practice for you to be an ally to us, and to continue practicing that. And I think when all of this started to happen, I remember like the majority of folks who reached out to me were Black women, and how important it is to, it felt like so good, but I was also frustrated because it tends to be Black and brown women supporting each other, organizing, doing the work. And so how do we continue to be allies for them as well? And sorry, I wrote some notes down. When I get questions about like, what can I do for you? I think a good response that I have been telling people is to start having these conversations with your friends and family. And when you see things like this, or this June, if you are having a great time right now and learning a lot, invite people to the June one, invite my friends, and, you know, like get together on a Zoom afterwards, or like sit outside for a picnic and discuss what we're talking about, because I think it's important to continue to stick with this conversation and not just, I'm so sick of listening and learning. I'm sick of hearing that. And I think it's important, but now what are you going to do? Are you going to continue to bring these conversations into your workspaces, into your friends and family's homes? Because I believe that that's how we start to lead to action. And I want to point out also, in talking about this, how lucky we are that there was an anti-Asian hate crime passed. But while that's an amazing victory, we still also, again, need to be allies to our Black brothers and sisters who the anti-lynching bill has not been passed yet. And so it's a lot of work, and it's very intricate. And I think that moving forward, everyone needs to continue to like be active allies and be practicing that.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree, Maria. From an advocacy standpoint, you know, it's as simple as just engaging with other public officials to let them know and educate them about the issues that are important to us, and then to actually enact policy changes that are needed. And as you point out, we need to have a seat at the table in whatever setting that might be, so that our voices are heard. Just throw in that Senator Matt Hansen and the legislature has proposed a bill, LB 442, designed to create a 14-member commission on Asian Americans. And so there's still time to support that bill, just as a starting point.
Awesome.
To make sure that our voices are heard. So there are other avenues that we can pursue for sure.
So everyone here can call their senator and tell them to support Senator Hansen's bill. Perfect.
Yes,
Absolutely.
So the congressional, contacting your congressional representatives, whether that's local, state, national, that's a really big piece of action for fighting any type of hate that occurs. It's also educating yourself and helping others to learn, but it's one piece that's really hard to do, and that's interrupting it when you see it. So if you see the microaggressions, if you see something happening to anyone, to be able to speak up and interrupt, saying no, that I'm sorry, that's not acceptable, or step in, because a person feels alone when that's happening to them, and to see somebody else step in at that point, that's a very hard thing to do. I've had an older woman tell me, she's 93, and she said, "Oh, Sharon, don't do that. You will get in trouble, and you can get hurt very badly. Don't do that." And I said, "No, you have to." So it's finding the courage to interrupt that discrimination that you see happening.
Sharon, where do you think would be a good resource for folks to start learning about this in our community or nationally?
In our to learning about what to do, or to learn about
well, like you said, to educate yourself
right.
just on the histories.
Sure. There's looking at the information. There's a website called Densho, DENSHO, that has a lot of the history of Japanese Americans. It has some Asian Americans in there, but they had a grant from the government, this education fund from the reparations, civil liberties grant, in order to put a website together, and they've continued to develop that. So that's there. The Organization for Chinese Americans, OCA, it's a national organization, also has information. The JACL that I belong to has information and some historical, and we put out a curriculum guide for teachers to use. And I have done in the past teacher training workshops to help them understand, first of all, what the history is, and then how do you incorporate that into different ways where children will understand, from elementary school with picture books and stories about friendship as a thematic unit, all the way up to talking about the Constitution and what constitutional rights were violated at any particular time when different incidents have occurred. So doing that, but I think when you also are working with advocacy in politics, because we really basically have this two-party system, it's important to understand what's important to each party, because there are people who will support the anti-hate in each party, and but it has to be what's important. And for one party, it's really more about is it constitutional or not, or how do I support the Constitution? And for the other party, it's really more about civil rights. So when we were, the JACL and other Japanese American groups were pushing for the passage of the Civil Liberties Act, it was a different kind of story that we took to each party. And that's how they were able to get a really strong bipartisan support, because you have to know what the principles are, or the beliefs behind whatever group it is that you're going to talk to, and that's how you can get your support when you're seeking that in advocacy.
Oh, thank you, Sharon.
Yeah, you are a wealth of information, and I actually again can't wait to hear about what you will present to us in the June table talk. I wanted to be respectful of everyone's time, and thank you all for being here with us today. I think I've learned a lot, and I look forward to our future conversations. And I'm seeing here in the comments that Inclusive Communities has posted the links that Sharon had mentioned. Thank you for doing that. So again, thank you for joining us in today's virtual table talk. On Tuesday, June 15th from 6 to 7:30, we will all meet here again. And for the Omaha table talk, conversations with the AAPI community, where we are going to do a deeper dive into the topics discussed today. I think we could have talked about this all day long. And there will also be opportunity for some audience engagement and small group discussions as well. So we look forward to that. The registration link is going to be shared in the comments section, and you will be able to find it also on the Inclusive Communities Facebook page. So we hope to see everybody there. We have 1 minute left. Are there any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
I just want to thank Inclusive Communities for hosting this panel, and for Krystal to moderate. And it's always an education to be with all of you and to learn more about your stories and your experiences. So it's really been an enjoyable hour. Thank you.
And we can fight discrimination by doing it together. I mean, that's the stronger part of it.
Absolutely. I'm thankful for you all. I'm thankful to have met you, and I can't wait to actually meet you in person someday.
I know. I'm excited to just I'm excited to have this conversation as a start, and I know that we'll be able to craft up some action steps together to push this forward and continue this conversation. So thank you to everybody who's listening, and to all of you here on this panel with me. This is what I needed, because it's been, I think, lonely trying to get through this past 6 months without a sense of community. So I'm really grateful for this.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, everybody have a good afternoon, and we will see you in June.
Thank you.